Forgotten fronts, the Elephant Men of Burma. Burma, 1941. Not the Burma of war, the other one. A country of teak forests so dense that daylight barely reached the ground. Rivers that ran brown and wide through valleys that no road had ever touched. A landscape that operated on its own terms, indifferent to the ambitions of empires and the movements of armies. And moving through it all, unhurried and immense, the elephants. There were around 2,000 of them working the forests of Burma at the outbreak of the Second World War. They hauled teak logs to the riverbanks, waded chest-deep through monsoon streams, and navigated terrain that defeated every machine the modern world had produced. A single healthy working elephant, trained in the teak industry, was worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime. They were not wild animals pressed into service. They were working animals with names, with histories, with handlers who had spent their entire lives alongside them. Those handlers were called oozies. A Burmese mahout who lived with his elephant, slept near it, understood its moods and its movements the way a man understands a lifelong companion. An oozie did not simply ride his elephant. He read it. He knew the sound it made when it was content and the sound it made when something was wrong. He knew its fears and its preferences and the particular way it moved when it was carrying more weight than was comfortable. The relationship between an oozie and his elephant was not a professional arrangement. It was something closer to kinship, built across years of shared work in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. The teak industry that depended on these animals was vast and methodical. A tree was ring-barked at the base and left standing for 3 years, seasoning on the stump until it was light enough to float. Then it was felled and dragged by elephant to the nearest waterway, where it was floated downriver to the mills at Rangoon or Mandalay. The work was slow and it was hard, and it required an understanding between man and animal that could not be rushed or manufactured. It took years to produce a good oozie. It took years more to produce a good working elephant. The forest held both, in their thousands, and the industry that connected them was the economic foundation of the country. Into this world in 1920 came a young Cornishman named James Howard Williams. He had served in the First World War with the Devonshire Regiment, then with the Camel Corps in the Middle East, then as a transport officer in charge of mules. He understood working animals, but nothing had prepared him for Burma. Williams took a job as a forest assistant with the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation. He was responsible for elephants across hundreds of square miles of interior forest, with camps 6 or 7 miles apart, separated by hills 3,000 or 4,000 feet high. He learned Burmese. He learned the elephants. He became, over 2 decades, one of the most knowledgeable elephant men in the world. By 1941, he knew 1,000 elephants by name. He knew their temperaments, their injuries, their histories. He had become their doctor, their advocate, and in some cases, their only protection against the harshness of the work. He had seen elephants solve engineering problems that baffled their handlers. He had watched them grieve. He had treated their wounds in jungle clearings with no equipment and no assistance, and had learned more about these animals in those moments than any textbook could have taught him. His men called him Elephant Bill. He would carry that name into the war. Japan struck Burma in January 1942. The invasion came fast and it came hard. 2 Japanese divisions crossed from Thailand into the south of the country and drove north toward Rangoon. The British and Indian forces defending Burma were understrength, poorly equipped, and fighting in terrain that negated most of their advantages. They fell back through the jungle, abandoning equipment and positions, trying to buy time that was not available to them. By the end of February, the situation had become catastrophic. The 17th Indian Division, retreating toward the Sitting River, found 2 of its brigades stranded on the wrong side of the only bridge when the order came to blow it. The bridge was destroyed with thousands of men still east of the river. What followed was desperate. Men swam 600 yards of fast-moving river under fire. Others were captured. Others drowned. When the survivors were counted, the 17th Division had been reduced from 17,000 men to fewer than 3,500. Most had lost their boots crossing the water. Between them, they had 550 rifles remaining. The blowing of the Sitting Bridge, one historian later wrote, sealed the fate of Burma. Rangoon fell on the 9th of March. The road to the rest of the country was open. The scale of what was happening was almost impossible to grasp from inside it. 600,000 civilians were fleeing north toward India. Around 80,000 of them would die on the road, from starvation, from cholera, from exhaustion, from diseases that move faster through a column of desperate people than any army could. The jungle tracks were lined with the dead and the dying. Burma was not falling. It had already fallen. Williams understood immediately what the Japanese advance meant for the elephants. The Imperial Japanese Army had its own plans for the working animals of Burma. Elephants could build the bridges and supply lines needed for the next phase of the invasion, the push into India itself. The oozies knew this. Many of them had already taken their animals deep into the jungle rather than surrender them. They were hiding in occupied territory with no certainty that anyone was coming for them. Williams made his decision. The elephants that could be reached had to be moved, north through the mountains into India, before the Japanese found them. In the spring of 1942, Williams assembled a column, 56 elephants, more than 100 people, corporation workers, their families, Gurkha women and children who faced a fate he would not allow himself to describe plainly. Refugees attached themselves to the column as it moved, drawn by the faint security of numbers. The elephants carried bedding, tinned food, live chickens and ducks that would feed the group along the way. The route north lay through the Kabul Valley. It had already acquired a name among those who knew what was happening in Burma. They called it the Valley of Death. Hundreds of refugees were dying there. Cholera, dysentery, starvation, exhaustion. The bodies of those who had gone before lay at the edges of the tracks. Williams led his column through it, keeping the animals moving, keeping the people moving, knowing that to stop was to die. The jungle offered no comfort and no shade from the moral weight of what surrounded them. They passed families who had sat down and could not rise again. They passed children alone on the track. They could not stop for everyone. Williams knew this and carried it and kept moving north. Then they reached the cliff. The route to Assam crossed mountain ranges, rising to 5,000 feet. At one point, the path ahead became a near-vertical rock face, 300 feet high. No vehicle could have climbed it. No conventional evacuation column could have climbed it. There was no other way through. Williams looked at the cliff. Then he looked at the elephants. The path was cut into the rock face, narrow and steep, with nothing below but empty air. The elephants went up one at a time, 56 of them in single file, on a ledge carved from stone above a drop that would have killed any that stumbled. Not one fell, not one was lost. When the last elephant reached the top and the column moved on into Manipur, Williams had done something that had no precedent in the history of the campaign. He had brought every animal through alive. He delivered his family to safety in India. Then he went back. By October 1942, Williams had joined the 14th Army as Elephant Advisor to the Elephant Company of the Royal Indian Engineers. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. The man who had spent 20 years learning elephants was now directing them as instruments of war. Field Marshal William Slim, commanding the 14th Army, understood their value precisely. He wrote later that the elephants built hundreds of bridges, helped launch more ships than Helen ever did for Greece, and that without them, the retreat from Burma would have been even more arduous and the advance to liberation slower and more difficult. Those bridges were stacked teak wood logs, reinforced with pylons, strong enough to carry tanks, built in terrain where no engineering vehicle could operate. The elephants carried wounded men out of jungle that no stretcher party could have navigated. They moved supplies to units cut off by monsoon and mountain. They went where nothing else on earth could go. Behind Japanese lines, Williams had another mission. The oozies, who had taken their animals into hiding months earlier, were still there. Some had been in the jungle for the better part of a year, moving their elephants through occupied territory, avoiding Japanese patrols, keeping the animals fed and healthy against the day when someone might come. They had no radio, no way of knowing how the war was going, no guarantee that the British would ever return. They stayed anyway. Williams went in to find them. What he found were men at the absolute limit of endurance who had not broken because they could not bring themselves to abandon their animals. The bond between an oozie and his elephant was not something that could be broken by an invasion. These men had spent their lives with these animals. They had raised some of them from calves. They understood sounds and movements that no outsider could read. When Williams found them, some wept, not from fear or relief, but from the particular exhaustion of men who had carried an impossible responsibility alone for too long. Among all the elephants that Williams knew, one stood apart. Bandoola was a large bull, 9 feet at the shoulder, with tusks that curved like the arms of a Burmese dancer, and skin that carried a faint lavender quality in the right light. He had been trained not by the breaking methods used on most working animals, but by a master mahout named Potok, with patience and without cruelty. Bandoola was the elephant who had led the cliff ascent. He was the animal that other elephants seemed to follow. He was the same age as Williams. They had known each other for 2 decades. Near the end of the war, Bandoola was found dead in the jungle. A single bullet to the head. One tusk had been removed. The killer was never identified. Williams buried him in a marked grave and said nothing in his memoir that adequately described what that loss meant. Some things resist language. This was one of them. While Williams and his elephants were moving through the forests of northern Burma, Scottish soldiers were fighting their way through the same country. The 2nd Battalion of the King's Own Scottish Borderers arrived in Burma in September 1943, part of the 7th Indian Infantry Division. They came from the Scottish borders in the southwest of Scotland. Men from small towns and farming communities who found themselves in some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth. The heat was unlike anything they had known. The jungle closed around them like a wall. Disease killed more men than the Japanese did in the early months. In February 1944, the Japanese launched a major offensive in the Arakan region intended to draw British reserves south before the main invasion of India itself. The 7th Division's administrative base was surrounded. The Japanese expected the British to retreat as they always had when cut off. This time they did not. What followed was the Battle of the Admin Box. For 3 weeks, the surrounded garrison held its position, supplied entirely by air, fighting off repeated Japanese assaults on a perimeter that included hospitals, supply dumps, and repair workshops. The fighting was brutal and close, often in darkness, often hand-to-hand. The Japanese broke through the perimeter more than once. Each time they were driven back. The admin box held. It was the first time in the Burma campaign that a British force had stood firm when surrounded rather than withdrawing. It changed the character of the campaign. The KOSB were in the middle of it, and they paid a price for it. They fought on through Imphal that summer. The Japanese invasion of India had begun. 3 divisions driving west across the mountains toward the Imphal plain, intending to destroy the British position in the east once and for all. The fighting lasted from March to July 1944 and became one of the largest land battles of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese lost 60,000 men. The men who survived on both sides came out of that jungle, changed in ways that did not easily translate back into ordinary life. The losses across those months were severe. Men died from Japanese fire, from disease, from exhaustion, from wounds that could not be properly treated in the jungle. The survivors came home carrying what they had seen in ways that did not always have words. There was a man from a small town on the southwest coast of Scotland who had been there. He was old by the time a boy sat and listened to his stories, old enough that the weight of what he had carried was visible in his face when he spoke of the men he had lost. He was tearful, not often, but sometimes the memory of what the losses had cost came through in ways he could not entirely contain, and the boy watching him understood, without being able to articulate it, that this man had seen something that had never entirely let go of him. He did not speak of those things for long. What he spoke of instead, the story he could tell without it breaking him, was an elephant in the Burmese jungle with a wire trap on its foot. He had found it. He had worked the trap free. He had watched it move back into the trees. That is what he brought home from Burma. That one moment of something saved in the middle of everything that was lost. A boy sat in a small house in Stranraer and was mesmerized by it and never forgot it, and decades later understood why an old soldier had chosen that particular story to tell. James Howard Williams returned to England in February 1946. He settled in Cornwall and wrote his memoir. Elephant Bill was published in 1950 and became one of the quiet classics of the war. Not a book of battles, but a book of animals and the people who understood them. He died in 1958, 60 years old, from a burst appendix that was mistaken for something less serious until it was too late. Before leaving Burma for the last time, Williams visited every elephant he could find, 417 of them. He said goodbye to each one individually. It took a long time. He felt it was the least he could do. The Burma campaign is remembered, when it is remembered at all, for its scale and its suffering. The 14th Army, 1,000,000 men at its peak, has been called the Forgotten Army since the men themselves gave it that name during the fighting. They knew even then that nobody at home was paying attention. But inside that forgotten war was another story. Men and animals moving through jungle and over mountain, building bridges and carrying wounded and hiding in the dark from an enemy that wanted to put them to work for the other side. Oozies who stayed with their elephants through an occupation rather than abandon them. A Cornishman who went back into a war zone because the animals needed him. A Scottish soldier who remembered, decades later, a single act of kindness toward a creature in pain. These are not the stories that make the history books. They are the ones that make the history real. We will never forget. Honor them.